name's Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today Luna and I are here to talk about my favorite reads of 2024. So 2024 was a pretty epic reading year for me. I read 285 books, which was far above anything that I could have imagined. I had a stretch goal of 250. So usually when I set myself stretch goals, I can get kind of close to them, but I did not imagine that I was going to beat it by so many books. So very exciting, and that left me in a predicament of trying to whittle it down to the best books that I read. So I decided to do 24 of my favorite books in 2024 because there was just too many to do like a top 10. If you're newer to my channel, just so you know, if you hear any snorting and snuffling in the background, this is this little girl here, my Lunita. She likes to hang out by me while I record my videos, and my place is kind of small anyways, so you can usually hear her little noises in the background. Don't be alarmed, there is not like a sleeping person behind the camera. And if you're new to this channel and you're wondering what I'm all about, I read across pretty much every genre with the caveat of not too much romance or thrillers. I will pick up one or two throughout the year, but it's not my primary genre. So if you're looking for those recommendations, there's better booktubers out there for you. But if you're into literary fiction, science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, mystery, horror, any of that stuff, I am your girl. So before we actually get into my top 24 of 24, I always do this on my list, and I want to mention my favorite middle grades and my favorite short story collections, just because I feel like I read a handful of each of those throughout the year, and it's hard to match like a middle grade up against an adult book or a short story collection against a full novel. So I just created my own little separate list for that. So this year was the year for short story collections for me. I read so many fantastic short story collections. It was really honestly very hard to pick 3 of them. So coming in at number 3 in my short story collections is Neighbors and Other Stories by Diane Oliver. So this was a book that I picked up through Book of the Month, and it is a posthumous publication of Oliver's stories. Unfortunately, Oliver died when she was 22, leaving behind this collection of short stories. Most of them are set in the 50s and 60s and deal with themes of race and current events at the time. It was still really thematically relevant to things today, unfortunately, but a lot of it was really beautifully written and lots of skilled observations, and so I thought this was a fantastic collection. My second favorite short story collection that I wanted to mention was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. So this was a book that I was a little bit nervous about reading. I've heard so much hype for Carmen Machado's writing, and I had just finished In the Dream House, which was fantastic. So I was like, maybe I should space this out. How is this going to possibly live up? But somehow it did. This was a strange, interesting, dreamlike feeling of short stories. Like every single one felt like waking up from a weird dream, and you can't quite remember all of the details, but you just remember this like vivid complexity to it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it was kind of like if you could take a really beautiful painting and put it into words. Everything was just so vivid and vibrant and surreal. It was just a really, really beautiful, complex short story collection, and it dealt with so many relevant themes, a lot of deep topics. I often get comments from people saying like, oh, I have such a hard time with short story collections. I don't really find ones that I like. So if you're somebody that doesn't typically vibe with short story collections, I would suggest Her Body and Other Parties. This is definitely a very memorable short story collection. And my favorite of the 3 short story collections was Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. So for me, this wasn't really a surprise. Last year, my very favorite book of the year was Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And so I immediately, after really loving that, started researching what else he's written, and I came across Friday Black, which was his debut and his short story collection. At a recent trip to a local bookstore here in Las Vegas called the Analog Dope Store, I found a copy of Friday Black and knew I had to get it immediately. I came home and I read it throughout a month. So I was doing a lot of reading sprints at the time, and so I like dedicated that to my reading sprints. Basically every day that I did a reading sprint, I would read at least 1 or 2 stories, and I really liked doing it that way. And that's because Friday Black is such a heavy short story collection. It's very short in terms of length, but in terms of content and themes and like social critique, it is extremely detailed and complex. These stories carry weight. Every single one of them says something very important about our current society. There were commentaries on unjustified shootings of Black people, how the court system often lets police officers and white people off for those shootings. There was commentary on like Black Friday shopping and how we basically turn into hordes of zombies, and comments on how we're essentially using social media as a feel-good drug that keeps us from really feeling these deep emotions. It was just fantastic. I could go on and on and on about this particular short story, collection, but all I can say really is if you want a book that is going to feel extremely timely and relevant, you want something that's gonna explore deep themes, something that you might cringe at sometimes because there are definitely some really brutal, gross, hard things to read within this book, but like for a purpose, it's not gratuitous. If you want something that's really gonna make you feel, I think this is a short story collection that is absolutely worth checking out. This for me cements the fact that Adjei-Brenyah is just gonna be an auto by author. Anything that he writes, I will pick up and I will read. Two amazing books in a row. They both stand out in my memory so viscerally because his writing is just so vivid and so real. All right, and then for middle grades, I don't really read a whole ton of middle grades. There are no kids in my family. I am the baby of the family, but every year I do participate in middle grade March. I usually just pick 3 to 5 books because it's kind of fun to keep a pulse on middle grade books once in a while. So 2 books that I want to mention are out of the 5 middle grade books that I read this year, and I just want to highlight them both as being really particularly good. The first one is Hamra in the Jungle of Memories by Hannah Alkoff. So this was a book that I found during like my research for middle grade March, and it just sounded like something that would really resonate with me. This is about a young girl, and she's dealing with family members who are showing beginning stages of dementia, basically. And this deals a lot with memories and how we allow people to age gracefully, and like understanding what happens as somebody maybe loses their memories and loses their ability to like stay present in time. My grandmother died of Parkinson's disease, and unfortunately one of the side effects of Parkinson's is dementia. And towards the end of my grandmother's life, she definitely had pretty significant dementia. And I was much older than the main character in this book. So I was, you know, aware of what was happening and able to understand it, but it's still such a heavy experience, and it's not, you know, a pleasant or an easy one to go through. And so I love that this particular book is a resource for kids that maybe are going through this type of situation and aren't understanding it all the way. It maybe would help them process their feelings around this type of event. And I just found that really meaningful and useful. And aside from that, I think it was just a really nicely told story. And the cover of the book is really beautiful too. So if you need a good middle grade book for one of your kiddos, I would recommend this. And my second middle grade book that I read this year was Alebrijes by Donna, Barba, Higuera. I previously read The Last Cuentista, and I enjoyed that so much that I actually have a copy of it sitting on my shelf here as one of my display books. I just love the cover, and I really enjoyed this story. So when I saw that Higuera was coming out with another book, Alebrijes, I put it on my TBR, knowing that I would get to it at middle grade March at some point. And so this year I was really excited to pick that one up. Was it as good for me as The Last Cuentista? Not quite, but I still really enjoyed it. This is a kind of a dystopian world, and it follows a brother and sister, and they're trying to survive in kind of a difficult situation. There are all of these monsters to be afraid of, and a system that is extremely punitive, and they have to fight back. So in the story, we have little like relics, little animals that were like sculpted out of metal, and they contain one soul, and they're used to kind of fight back against this sort of dictatorship. One of the things in particular that I really love about Higuera's writing is the way that she includes and mixes in Mexican culture and Mexican folklore with these very futuristic stories. I haven't seen that done at all really, aside from her writing, and it's something that's very refreshing, something that I really enjoy, and something that I wish more adult fiction authors would do as well. If you're unfamiliar with what an alebrije is in Mexican culture, they're these little like statuettes, and they're of different animals. They're painted in whimsical bright colors usually, and they're thought to contain like a soul within the statue. So the first time that I learned about Alebrijes, I was in Mexico City right before Dia de los Muertos, and the whole Reforma Avenue, which is like a big main street in Mexico City, had this art display, and people had created these gigantic sculptures of Alebrijes all up and down the road. It was just such a cool thing to see. And then a little bit later I got to Oaxaca, and in Oaxaca I went to an art studio where they were actually carving Alebrijes. So this is such a cool, beautiful piece of Mexican art and Mexican folklore, and I just again love seeing how Higuera mixes this concept into this futuristic like sci-fi sort of a story. I'm a fan of her writing, and I definitely think it is worthwhile if you have kiddos as well, or even if you don't have kiddos. I think as an adult there's a lot to get out of it too. All right, so with my short story collections and my middle grade reading out of the way, I want to go go ahead and get into the main list, what you're here for, the 24 favorites of 2024. Before I jump into those, I just want to mention briefly that this will not include any nonfiction. I read so much fantastic nonfiction in 2024 that I'm doing a completely separate list of 24 of my favorite nonfictions for 2024. Reading for the BookTube prize last year just introduced me to so many fantastic nonfiction reads that there's just no way I could fit them into this list. So we're jumping in, 24 favorite fiction books of 2024. This is across a lot of different genres. You're going to notice a lot of historical fiction, a lot of lit fiction, a little bit of sci-fi, horror, things like that. And that's very reflective of my reading. I read across most genres, and I really enjoy that. I think it keeps things interesting, and so hopefully you get something out of this list. I know that maybe not every single book will be for you, but I hope that some of them are. All right, so number 24 on my list is Milkman by Anna Burns. This is a book that I actually tried to read in 2023. I took it with me on a trip to Guatemala, and that was a mistake. This was just the wrong book for a vacation. This is a very literary experimental style book, and it is one that takes focus and concentration. I was trying to read it on like an overnight bus, like weaving through little Guatemalan roads and stuff like that, and it just was not the right environment for reading it. I couldn't concentrate enough. So I just felt really confused and not sure of what was going on. But when I reread it here in 2024, and I had time to sit and process it and really think about what was being said, I found it very interesting. So this is a story focused on a younger woman, and she doesn't really name anyone in the story. That's the first thing that I think took a little bit of adjustment for me. Everybody's like third older brother or sister-in-law, like there's no names given. So it takes a few minutes to adjust to who the people in the story are. And then she's being followed by this man, and she's having these strange interactions with him, and it's just very like off-putting and unsettling. This is a lot about like gossip and heresy and how rumors spread, and it is set during the Troubles in Ireland, although it is never identified in the book, if I can remember correctly, which is really interesting because actually this could be relevant to so many different situations, not just the Troubles in Ireland. I thought this was fantastic. It was really interesting. I've never read a book quite like this before. It was the winner of the Man Booker Prize in 2018, and it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize as well, deservedly so. I think that this does some really, really unique and interesting things. And it definitely made me think about the way rumors spread in a very different way. I don't know if this will be the book for everyone. I certainly think that some people will read this and find it frustrating or boring or not like the style of it. But for those that vibe with it, I think this will be an amazing read. Number 23 on my list is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wooden. This is a book that I read in an effort to read all of the books on the Booker Prize long list for 2024. I'm so glad that I decided to do this because I would have probably not found this book otherwise. So this is a really interesting story. We have a woman living in a house on her own. It's like in the 1960s in Holland. And there's this threat of her brother taking the house away from her. Like he's essentially letting her live there as a favor. And she's constantly feeling like this instability, like everything could just be taken away from her. And then her brother brings his new girlfriend and leaves her there at the house with his sister. And the two women don't get along initially. Isabel, the sister, feels a threat from Ava, the girlfriend, and feels like she's like scoping out the house and wants to steal it from her. Isabel is really like rigid and structured, and Ava is carefree. She sleeps late, she moves things around. She's kind of chaos in Isabel's world, and Isabel really resents her being there. But eventually the two ladies start to bond and develop a different type of a relationship, and the book kind of takes off from there. So I'm just gonna leave it there because this book is very twisty and I don't want to accidentally give anything away. The joy of reading this book is going into it knowing pretty much nothing besides what I've explained. I would suggest like watching as few reviews of this as possible and just like going in with an open mind. But this was fantastic. This is historical fiction at its best. It says some really interesting things, but it is also really gripping, psychological, interesting. There's just so much that was done with this book that made for a fantastic read. I've been seeing this popping up on quite a few people's best books of 2024 lists, and I totally understand why. This was absolutely a highlight of the Booker long list for me. Number 22 on my list is The Lion Women of Tehran by Marjan Kamali. So Marjan Kamali is famous for The Stationery Shop, which so many people have enjoyed. I did myself. I went into The Lion Women of Tehran hoping it was going to be really good. I got it as one of my book of the month selections, and I was not disappointed. This is a story of two friends. They are in 1950s Tehran, and they come from the same class initially, and then when one of those friends like finds some wealth, they move to different neighborhoods, and then there's class and money in the way of things, and their relationship becomes strained. Eventually one friend ends up in the United States and really looks back on this relationship with some regret at how she treated her friend. I really appreciated the complexity of this book. It wasn't just a simple like, oh, we had a childhood spat and moved on. There's a lot at play, and this spans so many years. Kamali is such an excellent writer. She really captures time and place so well, whether it's 1950s Tehran or modern day America. I think that is what really stands out in her books to me, is just how vividly I can imagine the scenes that she's describing, how well she helps me to understand what was happening in Tehran at the time, and the characters who began to feel like your own friends. Kamali really writes vivid, believable characters and beautiful relationships, whether they be romantic or platonic. Number 21 on my list is Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. So this is a book that I have seen here and there over the last couple years on social media, and I've always been really interested because the cover is very striking. And I finally picked up the copy of this book and read it, and wow, this is historical fiction, sci-fi, horror, kind of all mashed in together. It is a short novella, but it packs a wallop. There's so much happening in this book. This is set in 1915 America. I believe it's in Macon, Georgia, and we have the Ku Klux Klan spreading hatred across the county and the country to white folks everywhere. And we have a group of Black freedom fighters who are literally going out and doing battle with the Klan. There is some sci-fi elements going on, some horror elements going on. It is really effective. It's just such an interesting read that I'm not sure that I have adequate words to really describe this book in its entirety. Usually with novellas, I'm really critical because the story feels rushed, the characters don't feel well developed, and none of that is the case here. Clark really does a good job of creating a strong plot, a very interesting and engaging plot that moves at warp speed, but doesn't really feel rushed or like it's missing huge pieces. And the characters are all interesting and feel well fleshed out. It's such a feat for such a short book. I'm really impressed with this one. Number 20 is a book that I saw on people's lists pretty frequently last year for 2023, and I was really excited about it. It sounded like it was going to be right up my alley, so I read it right at the beginning of 2024, and that is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is Argentinian literature, and it is a mesh of literary fiction, historical fiction, and horror. We have a young boy and his father, and they're reeling from the death of the mother. They're on this journey across the country, and there are some strange things going on. Dad has some sort of malady, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. And then there are his in-laws. He seems dead set on hiding his child from them, and we're not really sure why. But as this story unfolds, we get a clearer picture of what's going on. This bounces back and forth between 1950s London and the dictatorship in Argentina during La Guerra Sucia. And this is just really an interesting read. I am not the biggest fan of super chunky books. I am kind of skeptical sometimes when books have huge page counts, but this is one where the page count was necessary. I did not leave this feeling like, oh, this author could have trimmed out 100 or 200 pages and made a more concise book. I felt like every word meant something, and this is also very fever dream-esque. There are parts of this book where you're reading this going like, what is happening here? But you got to get through the confusion, and as you get through the confusion, you get to a book that's really poignant and interesting. I really enjoyed this, and I'm really thankful to all the booktubers that shouted this out in 2023, that put it on their favorites list, because it definitely put it on my radar, and I'm really glad to have read it. Number 19 on my list is Somewhere Beyond the Sea by TJ Klune. If you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I absolutely loved A House on the Cerulean Sea. I am very particular about my cozy fantasy and cozy fiction. and I only mix it in very sparingly. But in this case, as soon as I heard this was coming out, I knew I had to get it. And I'm so glad that it was almost as good as the first one. I think the first one was better just by default because I didn't know the story or the characters, so it's a little bit more of a surprise. But this was like coming home after a long vacation and you're tired and you've been moving around, and like you get to slip into your bed and your warm cozy blankets for the very first time, and you're just like, oh, this feels right. That's how Somewhere Beyond the Sea feels to me. You're revisiting the same characters from the first book, with an addition of a new character or two, and it's just as joyful as the last one. Klune really stands out to me in all of his books for the way that he writes just these lovable characters that are interesting and quirky and sometimes eccentric. This book really talks a lot about fitting in and home. It talks a lot about not judging others and love being love. And I really appreciated that. In a list of really heavy reading with a lot of complex, deep, dark themes, this one was kind of the breath of fresh air and lightness that I needed. And it's not to say that it doesn't have deep and complex themes as well, because it definitely does make commentary on certain things. But just that cozy, loving environment within that book is, for me, a good contrast to some of the heavier, darker reading that I do as well. Number 18 was a new to me author, and that is Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. So I went into this not having any idea who Chuck Tingle is, but this is a story about a character named Misha. He is a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he's writing for a TV show. And then the producers of the show come to him and ask him to kill off the only gay character on the show. And he does not want to do it. He is like, no, I want there to be this on-screen relationship. I don't want it to like be this cliffhanger ending. I'm tired of doing that. And his refusal triggers a string of horrifying events, essentially. This was a wild ride. This is horror, but high octane, high suspense, edge of your seat, trying to figure out what's going on. And it was also thematically rich and deep, and talks a lot about Hollywood and queer baiting, and how essentially there's very few like on-screen gay relationships, and that trope of killing your gaze. I really liked this book. It was horrifying but fun, if that makes sense. It was everything you want from like a thriller or horror. Like I said, it still said a lot of deep and interesting things. I really enjoyed this. This is honestly everything that I really want from a horror or thriller. Something that keeps me at the edge of my seat, keeps me really invested in the characters, and says some interesting things along the way. And after this, I was like, this author is amazing. Was this a debut novel? I've never heard of this person before, and found out that Chuck Tingle had a previous book called Camp Damascus, which I immediately went and read, and I also really enjoyed. Not quite as much as I enjoyed Bury Your Gaze, but I still really enjoyed Camp Damascus. And I found him on social media, which is a blast. He wears like a pink like hood over his face, so you can't see who he is. And he writes apparently all of these like really raunchy stories with crazy names that I had no idea about, and he has like a whole fan base that he calls buckaroos. And he's just a really interesting person. So check out his books, but also check out his social media. He's definitely an enjoyable person to follow. Number 17 on my list is Nightbloom by Adzo, Medie. This came onto my radar because of the Women's Prize long list and my efforts to read all of the books on it. And honestly, when they released this prize list, I was like, I know I'm gonna really enjoy that particular book. This sounds so interesting from the get-go. So you have two cousins who are inseparable, living in Ghana, and then something happens and they go their separate ways. We don't really know what exactly compels them initially to stop having this close relationship that they once had. The thing that's really interesting that I've never seen done before is that Medie approaches this story from both perspectives. So the first half of the story is told from one girl's perspective, and then the second half of the story is told from the second girl's perspective. I know that some people have criticized it for feeling a little bit redundant because you're essentially seeing the same story twice, but I didn't feel that way. I actually thought that there was enough nuance and change within each perspective to make the story really interesting and to give you this really like full-sided complex view of how little misunderstandings can turn into big things. I thought this was a really enjoyable novel. I have Adzo Medie's other book, His Only Wife, up on my shelves, and I'm hoping to read it soon. Number 16 was All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd Barlow. So this is the story of a mother and her daughter, and they are living in kind of an isolated place. They have a very close-knit relationship. But the daughter is wanting a bit more independence and starting to push back against some of mom's quirks and eccentricities. And then they have a new couple move in next door, and the woman in this couple is extremely charismatic and just kind of ingratiates herself into their relationship. She starts inviting them over for dinners and for parties and trying to like build up a social circle around them, and that causes some tension and conflict. So one of the things that I really love about this book is the way that it shows how alienating it can be to be different. We have this main character, this mother, who's clearly doing her best. She's very loving and caring, and she's trying her hardest to raise her child on her own. But she is isolated and alienated for being different from everyone. Her ex-husband and his family mock her and treat her as if she's just this strange, weird person who doesn't deserve their kindness or their sympathy. Her daughter doesn't always understand her. Her daughter loves her, but doesn't always understand her. The only person that seems to get her is the next door neighbor initially. And it was a really interesting read. I don't know that every single person will love this story. I think it's kind of quiet and reflective instead of like in your face. But I just thought that it did a beautiful job of illustrating that alienation over differences. And I really did to a lot of it. I had a hard time fitting in when I was a kid. Again, a moving book for me. I don't know that every single person will find it as moving, but I thought this was fantastic. Number 15 is The Frozen River by Ariel Lahone. This was another book I picked up through Book of the Month, and this is a historical fiction that is actually based on the journals of a midwife from this time period. So this book is set towards the end of the 1700s, and a river freezes over, and in that freezing over, a body is found under the ice. Martha Ballard is the midwife in the area and is called in to do an informal investigation. She comes to some conclusions, but then some investigators that are like higher up in power are sent in from a different district, and they kind of overrule what she said, and this leads to a whole whodunit kind of a mystery. This book was thrilling, fascinating. There was like a sense of catharsis at the end of it. Just a fantastic read. And at times when I was reading this, I almost felt like it was too good to be true. But then you read the author's note and she explains like, no, everything in this story was pretty much based off of this woman's actual journals. And here are the areas where I filled in pieces of missing information, but the bones of this story are really very much based on reality. This is a book that I think most women will read and appreciate. I think a lot of men will appreciate it too, but in particular, I feel like this is a story that's going to be very cathartic for a lot of women. Definitely go into this with caution if you are sensitive to reading about sexual assault, but I do feel like it is not gratuitous and it makes sense within the story, and I think that the ending is worth it. This was one of those books that I finished and I just was like, oh, this makes me so happy to read this. And I'm happy to say that the couple people that I've recommended it to have all seemed to really enjoy it as well. So hopefully you'll check this one out. Number 14 is Bortherless Night by V.V. Ganeshanathan. This is a book that I read for the Women's Prize as well, and one that I actually predicted as having a really good chance of winning, and I wasn't at all surprised when it did win. I know that not everybody loves this book. Some people aren't a fan of the writing style. Personally, for me, I felt like it really worked. We have a young woman who has a goal of being a doctor, and then Sri Lanka is split apart by this civil war, and she gets called to the front lines to essentially be a medic. And she goes through some pretty horrific things. She has brothers who are off fighting, and she's seeing her country ripped to shreds. She witnesses hunger strikes, death of friends, many, many different things. So what I loved about this, first of all, is that I learned a lot about the Sri Lankan Civil War. I didn't know very much about Sri Lankan history in general, and this kind of introduced me to that. I found the main character to be engaging and interesting. I know some people have critiqued the writing style as feeling kind of dry or clinical or detached, but I actually thought that that was really fitting with who our main character was, what she's going through at the time. I mean, she's in the middle of this horrible war. She's experiencing death and destruction and sexual assaults and all of these, like, the worst of humanity around her, and she has to try to like compress that so she can continue to be effective in her role. So to me, it came across as somebody recounting experiences of war that had actually been through it, if that makes sense. that detached telling, that having to remove your emotions from it to be able to articulate what's going on. I thought that all really made sense with who the narrator of the story was. And I felt like this went a lot of really interesting places and said some very impactful things. In particular, there's like a scene about a suicide bombing that has continued to stick with me till now, and I read this book several months back. Again, not everybody loves this book. I think it's dependent on if you vibe with the writing style or not, but I found it to be really fantastic, and I hope that you enjoy it too. Number 13 was The Phoenix Keeper by S.A. McLean. So this is another cozy fantasy, and it came onto my radar because of my book of the month prediction videos. This follows a young woman who is working as a phoenix keeper at a magical zoo, and her phoenix program is in need of rehabilitation. They have one lonely male phoenix, and she's been advocating to get a breeding program going, but the equipment at the zoo is kind of out of date and falling apart and crumbling. When the zoo in the next community over has their phoenix eggs stolen, they need a safe and secure place to rehome their female phoenix. And so our main character makes the case that their zoo is the place to go. And she ends up getting approval, and it's basically about this journey that she goes through to create this world-renowned phoenix breeding program, how she has to secure the building, how she has to like rehab everything, and then how she has to get over her crippling social anxiety to learn how to speak to the public and advocate for phoenixes and the zoo breeding program. This book is just really cozy and lovely. I appreciated the author discussing social anxiety and the issues that come with that. I liked the relationship and the friendships that were built within this book. And I really just enjoyed seeing our character find herself and find her voice. If you're into a cozy fantasy once in a while, then this would be a book that I would put on your radar. I really enjoyed this, and I think a lot of people would benefit from reading it. Number 12 is a book that I picked up for Straya September, and it's a book that I was hearing about everywhere all year long, and that's Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. I went into this book not knowing anything about Alexis Wright or her writing style, not knowing what to expect with this book. Basically, I knew that it was about an Aboriginal community in Australia, and that was it. What a wild ride this story was. This is a thick chunker of a book, but it is a really interesting read. I was super engaged with this and just wanted to keep going to find out what was going to happen. This is a book that is truly hard to describe. But we have a gentleman who sees the oncoming climate crisis in his community and thinks that donkeys are the solution. And he's specifically looking for a gray donkey. And his wife is being driven mad by this. He has one son who wants to unalive himself and another son who is encouraging the unaliving so that he can become rich and powerful. There's just a lot going on. And like I said, this is a very wild ride. This book has a lot of social critique mixed with humor. There are these long run-on passages that are beautiful writing. It kind of goes all over the place. It's not like a linear story. We get some from the past, the present, and moves backwards and forwards. It's kind of a lot like having a conversation or listening to someone tell you a story. It was a very unique experience for me. At times I wasn't always sure what was going on, but at the end I was like, wow, this was such an interesting read. I'm sure there are smarter or more knowledgeable people than me that got even more out of the story than I did, but I just found this to be such a compelling read. Number 11 was Kindred by Octavia Butler. So I am not one for classics. If you've been following my channel for a long time, you know that I have a complex history with classics. I got forced to read a lot of dry, dusty ones in school. They were not enjoyable, and it just really has made me hesitant to get into the classic genre. But I have read Parable of the Sower, and after seeing a fantastic review by Kindles and Kicks on why Kindred was such an important book, I went ahead and read it, and I agreed with everything that he said. This is sort of a science fiction horror mashup where we have a modern day Black woman who is being flashed backwards to the past, to a plantation where people are still enslaved. And she has a strange relationship with the young boy living on this plantation. Whenever he's in danger or his life is threatened, she somehow gets dragged to him. It's a haunting story. It's brutal. This woman has to use all her wits and strength and everything to survive. Just whenever you think that this couldn't get more troubling, Octavia Butler does just such a fantastic job of bringing to life this horrific scenario and talking about the consequences of it. This is definitely one of the better experiences I've had with a classic, and I'm really glad in the end that I picked this up. Number 10 was The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This is a book that I feel like is getting a lot of deserved hype and praise at the moment. This was featured by Aardvark Book Club as one of their selections this year, and they recently did their end of the year like recap where members vote on their favorite book of the entire year, and then they feature that book in January as a signed special edition collection. So the Reformatory was the book that won that, and I'm really excited about that. This is a book that I absolutely loved, and I'm so glad so many other people loved it as well. This is about a young black boy named Robbie who defends his sister when she is being picked on by a white boy. And because of it, he is sent by a corrupt justice system to a reformatory school for 6 months. When he arrives at this reformatory school, there are some spirits and some haunting things that happen to him that lead him down a trail of like what is going on here. Meanwhile, his sister is on the outside fighting and advocating to get him released early. Whew. This was brutal and heavy and hard to read. There are moments where you want to toss the book across the room. There are scenes that will stick with you, but ultimately it is a reminder that things like this did happen, and that this is actual history, not just a scenario that an author made up for a story. This book is unflinching in its portrayals, but it's not gratuitous. It all makes sense within the story, and I felt really moved. This gets even more poignant when you learn that this story was actually based on one of Tananarive Due's family members who was a tragic victim of a reformatory school. It's just heartbreaking and so well done. Number 9 is The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. This was another book of the month pick and one that I'm really glad I got. This is set on Malaya during World War II. It was originally a British colony, but has now been taken over by the Japanese. And we are seeing what is happening to the people on this island as the Japanese come to power. This follows several different characters within a family, so we get a pretty broad picture of what's going on within this island. This is pretty brutal. There are, of course, a lot of difficult things that come up as we're talking about World War II and invasion. But I thought it was a really unique perspective. I have never read a historical fiction book in World War II set on Malaya, especially in that switch from colonial British rule to Japanese rule. I thought that that was really a fascinating period to focus in on. I learned some things for sure in researching after reading this book, and I just found this really emotional and moving. I really liked what Vanessa Chan did. I believe this was her debut novel, if I remember correctly, and I was just really impressed with that. I will absolutely read her writing in the future. Number 8 is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. So I read Deacon King Kong, I want to say 2 years ago, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. For me, it was interesting. I appreciated the writing style, but there was just something about it that didn't really like grip me in the way I wanted it to. I didn't feel like it had enough of like an emotional pull for me. Then I got into The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, and I was like, now this is what I was looking for. So we have a book set in the 1970s in Pennsylvania in the small town called Chicken Hill, and it is a community of Black and Jewish people for the most part. There is a young deaf Black child, and basically the state comes looking for him because they feel that he needs to be institutionalized, and then the community rallies around him to protect this child. This is a cast of characters that's super memorable, a story that's super interesting, and I feel like it took the elements that I really loved from Deacon King Kong and just polished them up and made them just a little bit more engaging and a little more emotionally impactful. I connected with this story a lot more. I already knew that James McBride was a good writer, but for me, this is excellent. This is McBride at his best, and I would highly recommend it. If in particular you liked Deacon King Kong or loved Deacon King Kong, I think you will really enjoy this one. Number 7 is A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. This is a book I read earlier this year as I had found a paperback copy of it in a little free library, and then I was super excited to find a really nice special edition hardcover on my trip across the Southwest earlier this year. I loved this book. It was my first time reading Marlon James, and I feel like I picked a book to start out with, like with a bang. This was such an interesting read. So Brief History of 7 Killings follows the attempted assassination of Bob Marley. Even though Bob Marley is never actually named within this book, we know who it's referring to. And it's told from a bunch of different perspectives that seem initially very unrelated to Bob Marley, but kind of all weave together to figure out how we get to this point. It starts before the assassination, it continues well after the assassination, it spans different continents, it talks a lot about politics, and in particular the politics in Jamaica, both like the local national politics and the international influences on those local politics. This book packs a punch. It says an awful lot. This book was a little bit disorienting and confusing at first because the dialect is written in Jamaican patois, which is a little bit of an adjustment. I do understand it fine, but as I was reading it, there was occasionally like words that would come up that I'm like, I don't know what this is, so I have to refer to it. And then also because there's so many characters and the book moves around to so many places and there's so many things going on. I think like the first 100 or so pages, you're kind of just coming to grips with what the setup is. And then the story kind of progresses from there. But once it gets going, and I just found this to be absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed this book, and I just think that anybody that's into historical fiction, has a particular interest in reggae music or Bob Marley, the history of Jamaica, anything like that, I think that this is a book you absolutely should check out, and I will definitely be reading more Marlon James in the future. Number 6 on my list was Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. This was a book that I read for the Women's Prize, and again, I'm really glad that I started exploring more of the prize lists this year, because this is definitely a book I would not have picked up if it were not for trying to read the entire Women's Prize long list. This book is squarely about motherhood, and this is a topic that I'm not really that interested in just because I'm never going to be a mother. I didn't know that I would relate to this book so strongly, so in reading this book I found a character who was dealing with a lot of really complex emotions, isolation, abandonment, frustration, dealing not only with this baby that she's raising, but also with her man-child of a husband who is essentially useless through most of the story. And there's just like a lot that I feel like most women could relate to within this story. It was a very emotionally complex book and talks about our changing emotions as we shift to different points in our life and the way that we need support at different points in our life. I thought this was just a really beautiful book. The writing was almost poetic. The description was just lovely, and I was really sad that this book didn't go farther in the Women's Prize as well. This was probably the most surprising book for me on this entire list, the one that completely caught me off guard, but I found to be excellent. Number 5 on this list is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. This is another book I came across because of the Women's Prize long list, and again, really glad to have picked this one up. I actually wanted this book to win the Women's Prize. It was my favorite for winning, but in my prediction video, I did a percentage, like which one I thought would win, and it was either Enter Ghost or Bortherless Night. And I said that Enter Ghost, the only reason I could see it maybe not winning the Women's Prize was because it would be a pretty loud political statement, and if the Women's Prize was trying to avoid coming across specifically political, they might avoid this book being the winner. That being said, I think that this is a fantastic read, and it is a political statement. It is about a Palestinian woman who lives in England. She's in the middle of a complex relationship. She's an actress. She decides to go home to Palestine to visit her family. And while she's there, she gets roped into being in a Shakespeare play in the West Bank. And that becomes like an act of defiance. This is such an interesting story. It's a concept I would have never ever thought of, but it makes so much sense in reading it. This book just said a lot, and considering how things are in that particular region of the world today, I felt like this was an even more poignant read than it would have been prior. Definitely fantastic writing, and I would highly recommend checking it out. Number 4 is When Things Are Alive They Hum by Hannah Bent. This is another book that I picked up for Stray in September. This actually originally came onto my radar because of Misery May, which is hosted by Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and by Gemma over at Gemma Books. So the two of them have this fabulous readathon that they do every May, which focuses on like really sad or miserable books. And the first year that Scott did this, he did a fantastic recommendation video, and that is where I first heard about When Things Are Alive They Hum. This is a story of two sisters. One sister has Down syndrome, which she actually calls Up syndrome, and their complex relationship. One sister has moved away to go to college and to kind of branch out into her own life. But when her younger sister is in need of a heart transplant and is then refused the heart transplant due to her Down syndrome, sister flies home and is trying to advocate and fight for her sister's life. This book gets into a lot of really deep topics. It talks about like the donor transplant list and how we assess whether somebody is deserving of a transplant or not. It talks about ableism and our perception of the value of human beings. It talks about the bonds of sisters, the lengths that people will go to try to save a family member. It talks about the black market and how people who are struggling with like horribly desperate situations can fall victim to scams and black market. This is just It's a brutally sad book, but it's also a really beautiful book. It's extremely emotionally moving, and I definitely think this is a worthwhile read. This is another one of those books where I'm so grateful to Scott and Gemma for hosting Misery Mate, because this is a book that probably would never have crossed my radar if I hadn't seen this recommendation video by Scott, and it is now one of my favorites of the year. All right, and now we're getting into my top 3 favorite reads of the year. I'm very excited. I think all 3 of these books are really fantastic, worthwhile reads. Of course, the caveat is depending if you like the genre that they fall into. So number 3 on my list is a book that I saw a lot of hype for. I don't know if it was last year, maybe in 2022, but that is Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Basterica. This is more Argentinian literature, and I have really been vibing well with Argentinian literature this year. I have read, I want to say about 5 books translated from Argentinian Spanish, and 2 of them ended up on my top 24. I don't know what it is, but I have been really vibing with Argentinian literature this year. I read a lot of translated fiction and a lot of books in Spanish, and so I feel like I have access to a lot of books from Latin America, but something about the literature in Argentina right now is really hitting for me. This is in fact the 2nd Argentinian book on this list, and considering like the amount of translated literature that I've read from different countries, I feel like that's pretty remarkable that both of those books ended up there. So Tender as the Flesh, I feel like this is a pretty well-known book at this point, but if you're unfamiliar with it, the concept of it is that there is a dystopian world and meat has become inedible. There is a disease that has contaminated all meat sources, and so humans are now cannibals. They're eating each other. And we have a gentleman who works at a meat factory where he is responsible for breeding and culling cattle or humans. And he goes through this whole process where he's like evaluating his life choices and evaluating society and how it's developed. And I don't want to go too much further into the plot of the story because, again, this is an easy book to spoil. And I feel like it's best if you go in not knowing too much more than that. I will say that this is a very impactful statement on the way that we consume food. I think that someone that is vegan would probably read this and go, yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about why you shouldn't like slaughter pigs and cows and chickens. It's just extra horrific in this book because it's made about people to make a point. But as a chef and somebody who does still consume animal products, I do think that this still made a really impactful statement. It made me think about where my meat is being sourced, how the animals are being treated prior to slaughter, breeding processes, and all of these things. I think it makes a really poignant point about like humane agriculture in general. And it's a lot about a whole bevy of other topics. It talks a lot about the human condition and human nature versus nurture. It just is a really fascinating book. I know not everybody loves it, and it is very graphic and gruesome. It is not an easy read, although it is not a very long one. It is really short in pages. But if you're particularly sensitive or squeamish to like blood and guts and gore, this might be a hard read for you. I do think it's worth persevering just because I thought it was such a fantastic story. Number 2 for me was Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. I read this earlier in the year and this was fantastic. So I was a little nervous going into it because I've read a ton of AI stories. I've seen a ton of AI movies, and I feel like often they don't really do anything new. They kind of play with the same concepts over and over and over again. What if AIs get super smart and take over the world and humans are threatened? And I've just kind of seen that done to death. But Annie Bot handles this particular topic in a way that I haven't personally seen done before. So our Annie Bot is our main character, and she is essentially programmed to be what's called a cuddle bunny. So she is there to service her master's personal needs. She dresses sexy for him, she's giggly and fun, and he can change her body settings to make her feel particularly turned on and receptive to his physical desires. And then he has some adjustments made on her. She has upgrades and things, and the more upgrades that she has, the more human that she becomes. She starts to discover bodily autonomy and discover that she has feelings that are impacted by the way that her master is treating her. Essentially, the more human that she becomes, the harder it is for her to fulfill her role as a cuddle bunny. I thought that this was such a fascinating conversation on bodily autonomy and sentience, and the boundaries that we put around machines as they develop more and more. I am so glad that this story did not lean into tropes and cliches, and that it explored some dimensions that I wasn't expecting. The second half half of the book really did catch me off guard, and it just made for so much more of an enjoyable read. I mean, I think the writing was good anyways, and even if it had leaned into like the artificial intelligence being smarter than humans trope, I think it would have still been a decent book. But because it went so much farther than that, it became a really special book. And if you're into sci-fi at all, if you're into books that comment on like bodily autonomy in regards to women, women's rights, things like that, then this is a book that should absolutely be on your TBR. And finally, book number 1. I'm so excited about this, and this is a book that has been getting all the buzz and all the hype. It's been longlisted for several awards, and deservedly so. It's James by Percival Everett. So if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me say that I am not a big fan of classics. And that holds true. There are very few classics that I can say that I've truly enjoyed. I've suffered through many of them. I've reread a handful trying to convince myself that, you know, I just need to find the right classics. And, you know, I have enjoyed some Toni Morrison, some James Baldwin, some Zora Neale Hurston, and some Octavia Butler. But, you know, I'm still working into the classics genre. So James came across my radar because I was hearing all this buzz initially about Percival Everett and his previous book, Trees. So I kind of like been like, oh, I want to check this author out eventually. And then James was released, and I heard nothing but praise about how it took the story of Huck Finn and made it so much better. Then Aardvark went ahead and featured it as one of their book club options, and I decided to pick it up. I thought this would be a great chance to check out Percival Everett's writing for the first time. And I did want to go ahead and read Huck Finn first, because I did read it when I was much younger, but I mean, it's been quite a long time. And while I remember the vague outlines of the story, I don't remember any of the details. And although you could read James as a standalone without having read Huck Finn first, I wanted to make sure I got all of the nuance, that I could catch everything that the story was putting out there. And honestly, I'm so glad that I did it this way. But the reason that James is my favorite book of the year is because it took this classic novel and made it a million times better. Huck Finn is a story from that time period. It's got a lot of blind spots. It's missing a lot of things. It infantilizes its characters, and it was, for me personally, like kind of an uncomfortable read. And then I got into James, and James makes the story so much more nuanced. It really fleshes out the characters and brings them to life in a way that Huck Finn doesn't. It adds layers to the story. It really makes it more historically accurate. It just does so much more than the original, and reading them back to back really allows you to see the depth that James provides that Huck Finn is really lacking. I've seen a lot of rewrites or additions to classics in modern literature. That isn't the most like cutting edge or new idea, but the way that James approaches this subject, the way that James builds on the source material, the nuance that it adds, it just, for me, blew my mind. This was absolutely fantastic. Percival Everett is now going to be on the list of authors where I'm going to go through and read all of their backlist. I really, really appreciated what this book did, and if you haven't read this yet somehow, absolutely put this on your list. But take my word for it, read Huck Finn first, get everything out of this that you can. This is absolutely a phenomenal book. So that is the end of my 24 favorite fiction books of 2024, with a couple middle grades and short story collections as well. I hope that you've really enjoyed this video and enjoyed hearing what books I really had a good time with. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and tell me what your top 3 favorite fiction reads of 2024 were. What stood out to you? Anything that you think I absolutely have to put on my TBR for 2025? And then let me know what you think of my picks. Did you love them? Did you hate them? Tell me all of the things. I'm just here to chat about books, so let's have a good conversation. And if you're not already subscribed to my channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.